for cultivating progress across the South, for working to unconditionally improve the lives of all, and for the bold underwriting of every Gravy podcast. SFA thanks our visionary Louisville, Kentucky friends, Pam and Brooke Smith.
Lately, you only have to open a window to know that weather patterns are changing. In fact, as I record this, New Orleanians are waging snowball fights on Bourbon Street. And adapting to a radically shifting climate means new farming practices, rethinking not just when and where we plant, but also what we plant. 9 species make up the majority of American agricultural output. 9. And when one of those crops fails, the consequences can be devastating. One way to strengthen American food resiliency is for farmers to diversify. And one fruit keeps popping up in that conversation: the pawpaw. You've probably heard of them, and each fall for about a decade now, the pawpaw makes the news, like in this 2011 NPR story.
A mango-like fruit that grows wild along the riverbanks. The fruit is called the pawpaw.
Often, that headline is about how the fruit was forgotten. But pawpaws aren't actually that much of a secret, because pawpaw trees have been in North America for 56 million years. And they produce our continent's largest native fruit. The trees grow in temperate forests, but the baseball-sized fruit is often described as tropical. The name even comes from a tropical fruit, one it's often confused with, the papaya. Both are aromatic and sweet, but pawpaws belong to a completely different family of trees, the custard apple. And like its cousins, the custard apple, pawpaws are yogurty and soft with big mahogany-colored seeds. A good one can taste like a banana, a pineapple, or even creme brulee. Pawpaws are finicky, so you probably aren't going to find one in a grocery store. They don't ship well, they rot a few days after they're picked, and if picked too early, they won't ripen at all. But it's possible that all of this is about to change, because pawpaws are getting domesticated. More and more pawpaws are making their way into farmers markets, restaurants, and even beer. In this episode of Gravy, we'll talk cultivation, what's gained and what's lost when a wild fruit is bred for market. You're listening to Gravy.
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 A production of the Southern Foodways Alliance, Gravy tells the stories of the changing American South. I'm Melissa Hall. Our reporter, Anya Groner, heads out to shake the pawpaw tree.
I'm standing in a field in West Virginia, about halfway between D.C. and Pittsburgh. The town is rural and hilly, home to just over 400 people, and it's called Pawpaw.
It's funniest when someone asks where do you live and you say pawpaw and they say, isn't that a fruit?
Today, Pawpaw is hosting a festival in honor of the fruit that shares its name, and it's hopping. Ben Townsend is playing fiddle on the bandstand, and booths selling local crafts form a semicircle around the softball field. But the biggest draw is the fruit itself.
I was kind of amazed that they were native to the area because we'd never seen them before.
A line of people stretches from the festival entrance to a taste testing booth. The wait is at least an hour.
My wife has been wanting to go to a pawpaw festival for literally over a decade.
Pawpaw trees grow in 26 states. There's even a few wild ones growing at the edge of the festival grounds. But for a lot of people, today will be their first time tasting one.
I've been told that they are custardy and delicious and tropical tasting.
The texture is kind of like a almost overripe avocado.
It's got too many seeds.
Despite its name, this is the town's first Pawpaw festival, and people have driven in from surrounding states.
I was not expecting to see this many people in the little town of Pawpaw, West Virginia.
Todd McCree grows pawpaw trees on a farm about 30 miles away and helped organize the festival. He tells me enthusiasm for the fruit has been growing for about a decade.
14 pawpaw festivals are going on from Illinois all the way to the coast. 14 festivals for one fruit. To me, that's awesome.
Todd attributes some of the fruit's growing popularity to COVID. During the early months of the pandemic, attendance at farmers markets skyrocketed.
In 2019, we had farmers markets that were struggling to stay alive. And in 2020, they quadrupled or quintupled in the amount of attendance.
The first year of the COVID pandemic, supply chains faltered.
They ran out of milk. They ran out of toilet paper.
Consumers began thinking more about food security.
If you have a backup plan, a farmer's market, you know the farmer, you can find food somewhere.
Todd sells pawpaw trees at the Charleston Farmers Market.
In 2020, I didn't open until May because of the quarantines and everything going on. In the first week of May, I made more in sales than I did the entire prior year.
But the pandemic isn't the first time pawpaws have had a moment. They appear throughout indigenous and colonial histories. Troy Wapongwe is a professor at William & Mary and a descendant of the Chickahominy tribe.
The scientific name of pawpaw, which is Asamina tribola. Asamina actually derives from a Virginia Algonquian word for wheat plum.
Pawpaws thrive in shaded understory along streams and creeks in nearly half of what we now call the United States. Native people would harvest the fruit in September, a time of year that Shawnee people sometimes call the pawpaw moon.
They would use it like they did other fruits, both fresh and dried, to be incorporated in their diet.
Cherokee people stripped the tree's inner bark and used it to make rope for basket making and tying things.
Those fibers are pretty strong.
European settlers ate pawpaws too. A 1709 account describes the fruit as, quote, an apple about the bigness of a hen's egg, as sweet as anything can be. A century later, the Lewis and Clark expedition survived on pawpaws when their food supply ran low. There's even evidence that the Underground Railroad cut purposefully through pawpaw thickets to provide food for people escaping slavery. But not everyone liked what they tasted. Neil Peterson is easily the most well-known pawpaw breeder alive today. We meet at the festival and talk beside a creek. He tells me that in the wild, pawpaws can be unpredictable.
Many of the wild trees have wonderful flavor. Not all. There are ones that have too much bitter in them, and there's some that have a taste of turpentine in them.
To fix this, enthusiasts hope to selectively breed wild trees, mimicking the cultivation process that produced fruits like apples and peaches.
The peaches we eat today are not like the wild peaches of thousands of years ago.
Neil says breeding fruit isn't much different from breeding thoroughbred horses. You start with the best specimen you can find. In 1916, the American Genetics Association devised an innovative plan to locate the thoroughbreds of pawpaws. The 1916 pawpaw contest was sort of like a vegetable competition you might see at a county fair. 75 participants sent in fruit from all over the South, Midwest, and Mid-Atlantic. Those pawpaws were judged for flavor, seed size, and condition, which was especially challenging. Remember, pawpaws bruise easily and rot quickly. They don't travel well. The judges deliberated, awarding one prize for the largest tree and another for the tree bearing the best fruit. The American Genetics Association got a prize of their own.
Really good germplasm.
Germplasm, as in genetic material from the best fruit in the nation. Horticulturists around the country started developing breeding programs. The most ambitious one was put together by a man named George Zimmerman.
Dr. Zimmerman, he was a medical doctor, active in the Pennsylvania Nut Growers Association.
Zimmerman had been collecting pawpaw trees for years and had a clear vision for what they could become. He planted an orchard and came up with an 18-year cultivation plan and was all set to succeed, except...
If you're breeding trees, you can't start when you're 60 years old, right? You can't. You got to do multiple generations of breeding.
A pawpaw tree takes about 7 years just to flower and even longer to bear fruit.
He had high hopes for the pawpaw and what he was doing, and then he died. And he died of a heart attack.
After his death, pawpaw cultivation pretty much stopped. Meanwhile, wild pawpaws weren't doing that well either.
We were urbanizing, and people were leaving the farms, and World War I happened.
At the same time, grocery stores were reconfiguring our relationship with food. Instead of growing or foraging for food, Americans bought what they needed. Pawpaws pretty much fell off the radar.
So, what happened? How did the pawpaw make a comeback? And what's in store for its future? But first...
Gravy has some big news for Dolly Parton fans. Lodge Cast Iron has launched a new collection of Dolly Parton cast iron. Inspired by the one and only Tennessee icon, each of the 4 cookware pieces brings a bit of Dolly flair to your favorite Southern dishes. Just like Dolly, cast iron is made in Tennessee and loved all over the world. Made with just iron and oil, the naturally seasoned cooking surface on a Lodge pan is made to last for generations, so you'll never have to change your tune. Take home the new Lodge Cast Iron Dolly Parton collection and shop cookware born to perform at lodgecastiron.com. For Lodge's longtime support of the Southern Foodways Alliance and this podcast, we thank them.
Back at the Pawpaw Festival, the line for the tasting booth has shrunk from about 100 people to a few stragglers. I wander over, hoping I can finally taste some fruit.
So we sold like 100 pounds an hour, and we're out.
Even without fruit to sample, festival goers are excited. Over the loudspeaker, an announcer starts telling what sounds like a fable about Neil Peterson, the botanist I spoke to before the break.
The scent of the fruit was in the air, bright pawpaws lay in the fallen leaves. He bent down and picked one up.
Around me, people make their way to the pavilion, where Neil is about to give a talk.
People call him the pawpaw guru.
He's really put his whole life into this project. Young people are coming up to him, and they're like, oh, can I get you to take a picture with you? Can you sign my guidebook or whatever?
We're probably going to pick up 500 to 1,000 people just because he is present.
Neil stands in front of the crowd, wearing a Hawaiian-style shirt decorated with pawpaw fruit and their maroon flowers. A fan designed it for him years ago.
I didn't eat my first pawpaw until I was a grad student at West Virginia University.
At the time, Neil was studying plant genetics and had an interest in the origins of fruit. His first taste of pawpaw blew him away.
I knew it would be sweet and delicious, but it exceeded my expectations. I thought it was a star.
He didn't understand why such a stellar fruit hadn't been domesticated. So he did what any good researcher would do. He hit the library. There, he learned about the 1916 contest and Zimmerman's unfinished breeding program.
I think I was 28, and I said, I'm young, so I can do this.
Neil decided he would pick up where Zimmerman left off. But first, he had to find Zimmerman's trees. And that led him on a kind of botanical treasure hunt.
So I'm spending time in a courthouse. Once you find the land deed, you're doing pretty good, you know. Now you have a plot, you have an address.
Neil traveled all over, going as far afield as Illinois and Pennsylvania. A lot of the orchards he'd read about were now neighborhoods or strip malls, and the trees still standing didn't produce good fruit. Then, after 3 years, he got a tip that Zimmerman's widow might have sent trees to the Blandy Experimental Farm, which is in Boyce, Virginia, not that far from where he lived.
It's a beautiful arboretum. They have all these big Japanese firs and cedars of Lebanon.
As soon as he got there, Neil noticed a few pawpaw trees growing along a stone wall. But their fruit didn't impress him. So he asked the arboretum director if there were any bigger pawpaw trees on the property.
He said, well, there may be some pawpaws in the backwoods, and he kind of pointed in the direction.
Neil drove down a dirt road.
Everything is just kind of a jumble, and all the woodland plants I'm familiar with, the spice bush and the hickories and the maples and the oaks.
And then he sees the leaves of young pawpaws.
The pawpaws were only growing about that tall. They weren't trees yet.
Pawpaws are clonal plants. They put out runners. Small trees can be a sign that there's a larger tree nearby. Neil parked his car.
The deeper I went from the road, the bigger the trees got. And then it's like, now these are some real pawpaw trees.
These were old trees with thick trunks, and they were growing in rows.
Well, that's something people do. That's not how plants grow in nature. This was deliberate. It means something.
Neil realized he was standing in an overgrown orchard, and the fruit he tasted was good. This was what he'd been hoping for. The trees Neil found were direct descendants of Mrs. Frank Ketter's prize-winning fruit from the 1916 contest. Neil collected seeds from the best fruit and added them to his growing collection, which included seeds from some good-tasting wild trees and at least one other historic farm. Then he quit his job, cashed out his retirement savings, and bought a farm in Pendleton County, West Virginia. He was finally ready to start his breeding program. But his good luck didn't last.
I planted the trees all in the worst drought year they'd had in about 60 or 70 years.
His seedlings died and he lost the farm. Still, he persisted, applying for grants, borrowing land, and planting again. Horticulture is slow work, but eventually it paid off. Several orchards later, he patented 7 new cultivars, naming each after a southern river.
And so my best varieties, 5 of my 7 varieties, originate from the Blandy backwoods.
Nearly 30 years after tasting his first pawpaw, Neil was selling cultivated pawpaw trees. If you've ever tasted an orchard-grown pawpaw, there's a decent chance it's a Peterson cultivar. Neil's efforts paid off, but pawpaw cultivation isn't over. Not even close. Fruit breeding is a generational project. It can take centuries. Neil's in his 70s now. His assistant, Rodney Deaver, plans to take over Neil's orchards and his breeding program.
Neil and I are working with a whole bunch of different pawpaw biodiversity. With genetic recombination, who knows what we're going to find.
Lately, pawpaws are garnering international attention.
A lot of the real changes in the breeding in pawpaw is probably going to happen in Europe and Asia. Right now, the main headquarters for our European pawpaws are in Switzerland.
Chefs are taking note, too, paying more than $30 a pound to overnight fruit to their kitchens. And pawpaws have been showing up in beer. Sean Wilson is the founder and chief executive optimist at Full Steam Brewery in Durham, North Carolina.
For our mission at Full Steam, it's to connect to the land and to one another. And pawpaw is like the perfect vehicle that's enabled us to do that.
But pawpaws aren't easy to work with. During the month-long harvest season, Sean and his family go once or even twice a day to a friend's orchard to pick fruit off the ground before it spoils. After that, he processes it.
Every time I'm processing pawpaw, it's like a couple hours commitment, like 10 at night to 1 in the morning.
Sean blanches the fruit and pulls off the skin. Then he puts it all in a food processor.
That dough blade pulls away the seed that's in there without crushing it, without nipping at it, because even those little flecks of seeds, if you know anything about pawpaw, you don't want to be eating that.
The last step is to push the pawpaw pulp through a rock sifter. A few days later, he does it again. Blanch, paring knife, dough blade, sifter. Processing as much as 800 pounds of pulp a season.
There's a pride that I have in knowing the work that goes into it. It is a labor of love.
The process is time-consuming and inefficient. But Sean says commercializing the fruit has never been his goal.
There's less opportunity to have these rarities, like these unique foods that have yet to go mainstream. And I think maybe that's why I'm apprehensive about it going big.
Late at night, Sean worries that scaling up production could cost the fruit its flavor.
Growing it to scale means blandifying it. And I think we should proceed cautiously with that.
Blandifying fruit. Sean says it's happened before.
The mass market banana is a shadow of what the original banana was.
Back at William and Mary, Dr. Troy Wupongwe shares Sean's concerns about how the pawpaw's growing celebrity status might backfire. Scaling up production too quickly could create a glut of fruit.
We're going to have a, excuse my language, crap ton of pawpaw that is not going to have market use.
Wupongwe studies food, and he's seen trends come and go.
We literally see it happening every 20 years. It was the avocado, it was quinoa. It's now in the pawpaw and yaupan.
These days, avocados are easy to find in U.S. grocery stores, but Wupongwe says the cost of accessibility is high.
No one's talking about the issues with avocado that have displaced indigenous people and these plantations throughout Latin America that have resulted in literal cartels being built around an avocado market. I don't mean to say that to sound super pessimistic, just find myself struggling with thinking through how one particular product is going to make a change in a larger ecosystem of food that should be biodiverse.
So what's next? Will pawpaws become the next it fruit, destined to flavor everything from soap to cocktails? Or will oversupply collapse the market and leave us with a flavorless fruit? Pawpaws are at a pivotal moment, and after all this reporting, I'm wondering if it's time to rethink what we even want from this fruit. I tasted my first pawpaw a few months ago, on the banks of the James River in Richmond, Virginia, where I live. I was on a hike, and I saw a man walk by with a shirt full of fruit. The pawpaws he pointed me to were delicious. And once I knew how the tree looked and smelled, I began spotting and sniffing them everywhere. Sort of like how when you learn a new word, you start hearing it all the time. It made me wonder, what else is out there, right in front of me, that I'm completely missing?
It's not just pawpaw. I mean, we have lots of wild fruit out here. It's aronia or chokeberry. Black walnuts is a personal favorite. Spice bush. I love some spice bush as a sort of culinary kind of allspice adjacent seed. I grow hardy kiwis. You can grow citrus trees. Shagbark hickory, sourwood leaves.
Nearly everyone I talked to for this story told me that pawpaws aren't the only native plants they eat, which got me thinking. What if, instead of turning the pawpaw into the next year-round strawberry or blandified banana, we follow this ancient plant out of the grocery store and into the woods? Climate change is already forcing us to rethink our relationship with the places we live and the food we eat. Pawpaws won't save us, but it's possible they could lead us to some of the answers we're seeking. It's possible some of what we're looking for is already here.
This episode was reported and produced by Anya Groner. Her award-winning writing explores the changing environment's impact on community and equity in the U.S. South. Her journalism and essays have been featured in the New York Times, the Oxford American, and the Atlantic. Her audio reporting and production can be heard on Monument Labs' podcast, Plot of Land, and WWNO-WRFK's podcast, Sea Change. She's taught storytelling in high schools, colleges, and professional settings, and encourages students to pursue their curiosity wherever it may take them. Anya lives with her family in Richmond, Virginia, and works as a teacher and freelance journalist. We thank Wendell Patrick for Gravy's theme music. We also owe a huge thank you to Clay Jones and Broadcast Studios here in Oxford, Mississippi for recording and mixing Gravy. Managing editor for Gravy and all other SFA media is Sarah Camp Milam. Olivia Terenzio is our podcast editor. Fact-checking comes courtesy of Heather Cole. Mary Beth Lassiter is our publisher. Visit us at southernfoodways.org to learn more about our work. While you're there, watch a film, listen to an oral history, read an article from Gravy Quarterly, or make a donation. Your dollars fund our work and help us make more gravy. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating or review and tell a friend, because there is plenty of gravy to go around.